Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Welcome to this webinar on the new social contract, our corporations, the absent third party. It is my great pleasure to welcome all of you. My name is Katie Abbott, and I will be your moderator for the session. I am a manager of inclusive economy at BSR, and BSR is a global team of sustainable business experts, and we work with companies to create a more just and sustainable world. We have a particular interest in this topic on the new social contract, and we've been working with our member companies and our partners over the past few years to explore the changing nature between business and society. This past summer, our team at BSR published a report that outlines our perspective, and it's titled "The Business Role in Creating a 21st Century Social Contract: How the Private Sector Can Support Economic Prosperity and Social Mobility." We won't go into the specifics of that report today, but if you are interested in additional resources on the topic of social contract, it's available for download on BSR's website. I'm delighted to be joined by a wonderful panel of experts this morning. You can see them all here, including Alan White, VP and Senior Fellow at Tellus Institute, Alexandra Mousavizadeh, Partner at Tortoise Media, Mathew Lawrence, Director at Commonwealth, and Stephen Brammer, Dean of the School of Management, University of Bath. I will ask each panelist to introduce themselves at the beginning of their presentations coming up shortly. And these expert speakers are going to share their views on why do we need a social contract fit for the 21st century, and what is their vision for a new social contract? How can indices operate as a means of corporate accountability, and are they effective in the development of a new social contract? How can business take action? And how should we rethink traditional business models? And why is reevaluating the relationship between business and society particularly urgent today in the middle of a global pandemic? I should point out too that we are recording this session, so it'll be available shortly after the event for you to watch and share with your colleagues and friends. And also, you'll see that there is a chat function, and we would like you all to post your questions. We'd like to make this session as interactive as possible, and we've blocked a full 30 minutes for Q&A at the end. So the more questions and the more riveting your questions, the questions you post, the more lively and interactive that discussion will be. So enough from me, and it's time to jump into this fabulous panel and have this timely and crucial conversation. So first, Alan, could you please introduce yourself and then help situate us all in the social contract landscape? Some in our audience might not be familiar with this term. It's not a term that we traditionally use in business, though we may remember it from some of our political theory courses. So could you help us understand the history of this term and how the relationship between individuals and institutions has shifted over time? And also, what is broken about our social contract today? So over to you, Alan.
Well, thank you, Katie. Pleasure to be here with the panel and with the audience. It is a moment in time to rethink the social contract, and as a historical footnote, I would mention that in 2007, I wrote a piece for BSR called "Is It Time to Rewrite the Social Contract?" So I've been rewriting it for the last 13 years and probably 20 years even before that piece. So thanks to BSR for provoking me. The social contract, let me cover about 300 years in 15 minutes. I'm sure there'll be no problems, no details left out. I'd like to set the stage, trace a tiny bit of history, the contemporary misalignment of the contract, that is corporations and a contract, my own evolution, and some elements of the path forward. The precursor to the social contract we're discussing is as old as the 1700s, when, as Katie mentioned, some number of philosophers, Rousseau, Locke, Hobbes, all referred to something like a bilateral agreement, a tacit agreement between citizens and society, citizens and government rather, that would lay the foundation for democratic societies. So we're talking now 300 years plus, of the idea of a contract between a citizen and her government. The idea is very simple. Citizens delegate certain responsibilities to government. Government in turn provides certain collective goods that individuals on their own cannot provide, but need to survive in a stable, prosperous society. So the rule of law, property rights, education, environmental protection, and so on and so forth. This was a sensible foundation. This bilateral contract was sensible and indeed a breakthrough concept after the age of royalty and feudalism. Appropriate, inventive, and really earth-changing in many ways for societies which back then were largely small agrarian guild-based societies with enterprises that today would look like your local country store, more or less. In the middle of the 1900s, this concept of the corporation emerged, the limited liability corporation, the publicly chartered corporation. And initially it was founded for purposes of public infrastructure by and large in most countries. So build a road, a canal, form a dam to keep society, to bring societies along and enable a certain level of development, still primarily agricultural, but some industrial, bring it along in formation that was publicly chartered and time limited. So build a road in 5 years or 10 years and stay within budget, and that's the end of that corporation. That changed, of course, by the mid to late 1900s, when corporations went from small, I'll say mom and pop farmsteads to larger enterprises, growing as the economies grew, international trade intensified, and you had companies, particularly in banking and resource extraction, that grew very rapidly by the 1880s, 1890s, turn of the century. You had enterprises that began to look like the modern version of the corporation. Post-war, let me jump ahead. As globalization of markets proceeded, world trade increased exponentially. Transnationalization of corporations happened along the way. So companies based in the UK, based in France, based in India, based in the US and elsewhere were no longer contained within their borders, but rather spread their sales and their supply chains across the globe. By the early 21st century, that's where we are today, the 5 largest global corporations exceed $250 billion in revenue. Some companies, as you know, by reading the news, have now achieved a $1 trillion, that's a T, $1 trillion market capitalization. The tech companies in particular, Amazon.
There we go.
And today, the economic and by inference, the ecological, the social footprint of these large corporations exceeds the economic, let me say, the economic might, the economic size of these corporations exceeds the GDP of 75% of the world's nations. So you have corporations in terms of their economic muscle, the size of whole countries. And that's the world we live in. And this is true across many, many different nations. Of course, the Japanese, the Zaibatsu, the Korean K-balls, the US, European transnational corporations, the Russian extractive industries. These are companies whose reach truly, whose wings are spread across the globe, or a good part of it. A dramatic shift from the beginning of this story, this saga, back 200-300 years ago. In my own evolution in this business was triggered by actually a couple of events. I'd say my own journey, I think probably many on this call have moved along the path I have, from regulation to reform to redesign, 3 R's. My wake-up calls were in the 80s. And many of you, I'm probably, maybe my memory is a little shoddy, but also a little longer than most on this call. But the Bhopal catastrophe in India in 1984 with a tragic leak of chemicals killed 3,000 people. The Exxon Valdez spill in the waters off Alaska, 12 million gallons of crude oil. But along the way, also the Brundtland report on our common future. These are all milestones, markers along the way to thinking about corporations and their role in society. In my own experience with Ceres, a prominent NGO in the US, where it essentially invented environmental reporting, at least in the North American case, and later GRI, which I co-founded in the late 2000s. These were efforts that I would call reformist, incrementalist. They were, at the time, they seemed like changing the world was possible by doing a little better through disclosure, transparency, and I think it has been progress, and it's certainly moving in the right direction. But by the early 2000s, I and many others were getting very impatient because incrementalism seemed to be less and less effective given the issues at hand. For that reason, I shifted my focus, and along with many, many colleagues, hundreds of colleagues, to think about what we call redesign of corporation, not simply reform, but redesign. Real thinking, rethinking the fundamentals. What are these creatures? How are they currently structured? How can they better be structured for a world in which their footprint and fingerprints are so extensive as to be a new, almost a different phenomenon than where they started many years ago. Though we saw in clear view the limits to regulation, to reform, and began to think about concepts such as repurposing, recreating governance, restructuring ownership, and chartering, and this is still a wish or a possibility, chartering not at the state level as we do in the States, not at the national level as most of Europe does, but at the global level. If we have transnational corporations operating in the way I've described, borderless essentially, to pay their tariffs and pay their taxes and so on, but essentially their operations are borderless, why do we charter or develop articles of association at the national or state level? Isn't there a case to me for a global charter? So one idea among many is to reflect the notion, the idea, the evolution of the corporation and try to align the reality of how operations happen with the governance and purpose and ownership structures. So when we think of a way forward to do just that, how to build a contract, how to rethink the contract, use the social contract as a device for a conversation and ultimately a movement for going from bi to trilateralism in the social contract. So as I said years ago, and as Katie mentioned, thinking about the corporations as a third party, a trilateral social contract, along with governments, along with citizens. I'm not saying this might be the end of the story. You could argue that civil society in some collective fashion ought to be named as a party to this contract. You might argue that labor in its own right ought to have a seat at the table in revising the contract. So I won't speak to those today, but I don't want to sound exclusive, but what I do feel strongly about, and the case is staring us in the eyes, in the face, that the corporation needs to be brought into this, into a trilateral relationship, along with citizens, along with government, because this is in fact what's going on the ground. So we need to do this very briefly, I think, along several ways, several vectors, if you will. We need to make corporations into entities, or think about corporations, they already are entities of multi-capitalism. They act as assembly points and formations which bring together multiple capitals, social capital, human capital, natural capital, and so forth. And they bring them together in what has been called team production, a lovely term invented a few years ago, team production. They bring all these capitals together and bang, out comes value. What's value? An automobile, a ton of steel, a banking service, and so forth. So all these capitals are essential and must be measured and reported, and thinking about the enterprise as this assembly phenomenon that brings and refines and processes and enriches, hopefully, these capitals to create value for all of us. So as we go forward in conclusion, my agenda looks something like this. One, we need to repurpose. The old Milton Friedman adage about profits being the sole function of business is so outdated now as to be actually very dangerous to us as citizens, as a planet. We simply can't go on thinking about corporations as profit engines. It's such a narrow, myopic view of what business does. It's actually somewhat insulting, quite honestly. And many chief executives will say exactly that. We are not profit engines. We are value creators. Yeah, we're making profit along the way as a means to an end, not the end in itself. We need to say goodbye to shareholder primacy. Shareholder primacy is the bane, I believe, of many of my friends in companies. You talk to particularly mid-level, upper-level executives. Shareholder primacy is like a set of handcuffs, and its presence and its continuation is a real drag on recreating purpose and ultimately bringing the level of citizenship which we all expect of our corporations today, and which many already strive for. We need to democratize boards, diversity on boards, to get this message of purpose loud and clear, embedded in the governance structure. I would say we need to raise the bar on investors so that companies seek investors, not just investors seek companies, and the investors that companies seek should be those with a, call it what you like, an ESG, some orientation toward a broader mission than simply profits, and short-term profits, I might add. We need to reinvent accounting and reporting. I've had some experience in that game, and it goes on, as we'll hear later from this panel, on and on, to create a truly global structure and format, generally accepted framework for reporting. And finally, we need to bring systems thinking to companies and their investors that is now woefully absent. So the old adage that companies cannot thrive in societies that fail. Societies fail because systems fail, whether it's ecosystems, social systems, other systems. They fail, they struggle when the environments in which they operate are fragile and dysfunctional. The only way to solve that is to put money, is to bring investment money, bring capital to those, or persuade, if you will, or even require investors to think systemically and to think, to get companies to invite those systemic thinking investors to the table. And I'll close with a moment with just a few thoughts on the pandemic. The pandemic, one of the silver linings of the pandemic, and I'm reluctant to use that term when talking about a global health emergency, but honestly, one of the silver linings of this pandemic has been, it's been a crucible of corporate purpose. It has put to the test the words, the intentions, the commitments, the pronouncements, the declarations of many companies, many business associations to act in a way commensurate with the emergency, to act as citizens, as in citizenship. And the results, they're mixed. there's been studies, I've been involved with studies, what has been the reaction to the pandemic? Who are those that have stepped up? Who are those that are capable of stepping up, whether it's in treatment of employees, health and safety, community interactions with communities, the whole gamut of issues that this pandemic has raised. What has been the reaction of companies to that? There's some good data on that now. A group called TCP, Test of Corporate Purpose, produced a report. Another group called Just Capital, Oxfam, has produced a report looking at buybacks and dividend payments in the midst of the pandemic, which unfortunately yielded very distressing results. And so it's been a prompt, a provocation, and a moment to ask how far we've come in repurposing, how far we've come towards global citizenship or sub-global citizenship. And if we can't deliver, if companies are failing to deliver, those that are, God bless them. If they're not, this is the moment to really reflect on what citizenship means in the current moment. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Alan. That was great. You clearly set the scene and you mapped out the term social contract and also the significant role of the rise of the corporation. And you also outlined some of the solutions that we're going to dig into a bit over the next couple of panelists. So I'd like now to turn it over to Alexandra to introduce herself and share the role of data and different indices in the social contract. So help us understand, how do we hold companies accountable? And also we're looking forward to you sharing this ambitious project by Tortoise to help us understand corporate actions and which companies are truly good citizens. So Alexandra.
Thank you, Katie, and thank you, Alan, for your great thoughts on this. It feels like a really nice tee up to the question of how you take this social contract and put some metrics around it, and get very concrete about how you hold companies to account. Now, it's hard to say whether, by the measure of our index, whether they're good citizens, but we certainly on a relative scale can tell you a bit about who's doing well according to sort of the broad sustainability and responsibility metrics that we have here in the UK, where we're measuring the FTSE 100 on their responsibility footprint or their sustainability footprint. So if I just take you back a little bit and tell you about why we did structure the index the way we did, and then go through some of the results that we found, I think that would be, and I'll try and keep it short. There's obviously a lot to talk about with more than 130 indicators across companies like the FTSE 100 who have 20,000 subsidiaries. So there's a lot to chew through in the data. But once having wrestled all of that down, it is interesting to see what emerges. But just to tell you what we've been wrestling with is that we had that conversation internally. We had it with corporates. We had it with the UN, who set the SDGs as targets for 2030. And we were asking people, what keeps you up at night? What is it that you worry about in light of that? Nations are slipping in reaching those 2030 goals when it comes to the SDGs. And it was a resounding sort of sigh of the issue that there was a sense that companies are becoming obviously so big, they have a big role to play in reaching these targets, but there's a lot of talk and there's not enough walk. So we structured the index to look at what companies saying they're doing versus what they're doing. And we looked at every element that a corporate could possibly be held accountable for in terms of the SDG agenda, which allowed us to look at pretty much everything. So we look at climate, we look at responsible business when it comes to remuneration or the way companies pay and treat employees, but also looking at equality questions, so gender and diversity and disability and so on. We look at human rights, we look at modern slavery, we look at tax evasion, we look at sort of pretty much anything where a company can do something we try and map metrics around that. We look at companies' own reporting, and we look at a lot of third-party data, tribunal, data. We look at, as I said, tax data and the CDP and so on, what companies sign up for and actually what they're reporting against. And out of that emerges an interesting picture, because the dilemma between feeling good about having a purpose, which is incredibly important, from taking that from actually setting targets, measurable, funded targets, to translating the targets into actual performance, has made a lot of companies sit up and say, "Ooh, actually, it is, time is up," because we can see where there is a delta between the talk and the walk. Companies are saying, we need to actually translate this into performance, and it's very clear. What we've done is create a very clear profile of companies on their talk versus walk performance. So that has been I think we're the only index that does that. It has led to a lot of engagement with the companies, and the question I think Katie raised in the beginning is, like, what is the role of these indices? The issue with indices is that you have data that carries the problem of one size fits all. Does it fit on specific sectors? Is it appropriate for all of these companies? And as we expand the index, that question becomes ever more important. But actually, what indices do so well is that they create a race to the top. Nobody wants to be stuck at the bottom of an index, especially one that's getting a lot of traction like this one. So it does. It has meant that companies have really looked at what we're reporting on. It has meant that we've seen a lot of change. We released this index a year ago, and we've seen a tremendous amount of change already in companies trying to report better, but more importantly, trying to do better, because it's become very visible. Now, it is a crowded space. We know that. We know that there's other indices out there that like the FTSE Russell, the MSCI, the Sustainalytics, and Arabesque, and they're all great. But I think that this one, our Responsibility 100 index, really teases out the issue of the sort of the conversation versus the performance. And you would say probably all companies have some kind of talk, and maybe not so good on the walk. But you'd be surprised, actually, the companies that sit at the bottom of the list haven't even started the journey on setting targets and having a purpose and figuring out where they sit in this, as Alan said so well, this context of, we all need to pull our weight. And there is the contract now is very much looking at, or the social contract, very much looking at the corporates that are perhaps got more capacity and more capable in pushing the agenda on responsibility and having an impact on the world that we live in. I know that we have many other speakers today, so I'm going to probably stop there and then can take any questions in the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Alexandra. One quick follow-up question for our audience. If they're interested in learning more about the Responsibility 100 Index, where do they find it?
Yeah, we are, as Katie, as you said, I think I forgot to introduce myself, actually. My name is Alexandra Mousavizadeh. I am one of the partners at Tortoise Media, a new media platform that we founded 2.5 years ago. It was James Harding, former head of BBC News, and Katie Vanek-Smith, president of Dow Jones, who founded Tortoise Media. I came in as a founding partner to set up the intelligence team, which is the part of Tortoise that builds indices. This is the first one we came out with. We've also built a big global index on AI, but in order to take a closer look at our Responsibility 100 index, go to tortoisemedia.com and look at the intelligence side, and you'll see all of the index work there. You can go and look at how companies are performing in a great amount of detail. Pick any company, and you'll see exactly what targets have been set. And on the walk side, you can look at every single indicator that we measure companies against, where they're sourced, how much they weigh, what the definition is of them, and how companies are performing, so all of their data. But any questions, please do let me know. My email is on there as well. I'm sure Katie is happy to share it after this talk as well.
Yes, thank you so much. I see lots of questions coming in through the chat, and we will get to those shortly. And I see a lot about how, this is great in theory, but how do we really get to this in practice? So I'd love to bring in Mathew Lawrence. Can you please introduce yourself and your work at Commonwealth? And also share your thinking around reimagining the corporation. How can we tackle inequality and build a new social contract by thinking about different ownership models, rethinking financial structure, and different social infrastructure? So Mathew, over to you.
Absolutely. Well, first, thanks very much for being here, and it's a pleasure to follow on from two great presentations. I'm Mathew Lawrence, as mentioned. I'm director of a UK-based think tank called Commonwealth. Two separate words, nothing to do with the royal family, but that, as the name suggests, looks at how we can reimagine ownership models so that we can share in common the wealth we create in common. What I want to do today is just sketch a couple of themes as was teed up there. Firstly, about how the corporation really is the fundamental institution of our economy, and therefore at the heart of our social contract in terms of the distribution of rights and responsibilities, the distribution of voice and power within society. I think when you think about the corporation and indeed the company, not just the legal structure of the corporation, I think there's this paradox that it's obviously absolutely central to addressing the climate emergency, the inequality crisis, stagnant productivity. We can't address these problems without reimagining the company and without the company being the heart of those solutions. But at the same time, it's also a critical driver of these problems. So I want to explore that a little bit. I want to then make this argument that actually the corporation is itself a deeply social institution. Its exceptional privileges that allow that productivity and wealth creation are socially granted, they're publicly maintained, and ultimately they're legally recodable. I want to tee up this point around changing structures of ownership, of governance, and how that's transformed the company and how that's been exposed during the crisis, and then end with what could be an alternative vision. And I think, just to prefigure the ending and touch on your question of how, I think one of the key things here is that the agenda of reimagining the company should be something that can broadly have a pluralistic, unifying political agenda, because there's it touches on many of the themes of both left, right, and centre. So I think in the UK, and this is UK focused, but I think this very much applies, and in fact it's more extreme in the US in some ways, but there's been these key shifts in ownership, in managerial structure, in legal structure of the corporation in recent decades. And that's had a number of profound trends that are really noticeable. So we've seen the rise of concentrated ownership amongst vast institutional investors. So think of BlackRock, Main Street, these vast asset managers. So in the UK, the two largest asset managers now own more than 10% in roughly 1 in 3 FTSE 100 companies. If you look at the US, if you look at BlackRock's stake in the SP 500, it's huge. So they wield vast power. Critically, we also have the rise of very short-termist financial intermediaries who corral votes attached to shareholding, and yet they don't actually often act in the ultimate interest of the beneficiary, the saver, the person who's saving for their pension. So they often act against labour, social, or environmental interests. And we've, of course, seen the rise of shareholder primacy transforming the company not into a purposeful institution of production, but actually into a space for wealth extraction. So if we look at, and this is not including data from the pandemic, but we look at the FTSE 100 between 2014 and 2018, we can see that net profits companies generated was 551 billion. And of that, they returned 442 billion pounds worth to shareholders. Now, if the UK economy in that time, wages had risen at the same time as increase in dividends, the average worker will be £9,500 better off. So we can really see this divergence in the economy. So what are the effects? Well, in a world of sharp inequality in wealth, in which wealthy own a vast proportion of financial and pension wealth, these rising value of returns to dividends, the increase in share buybacks, is naturally a dynamic of divergence, an increase in inequality. We've got weak channels of collective voice, so property rules the firm. In the UK, workers have very little constitutional participation rights, voice rights in the firm. So the company is ruled by shareholders and executive management. And this creates an undemocratic, extractive, and financialized and low productivity status quo. So what's an alternative vision? So we argue for imagining the company as an institution of the commons, and I'll explain a little bit further. So at the moment, the corporation is a legal institution for sort of combining labor and capital for production. And that institution is ruled oligarchically. By that I mean, rather than sort of economic and political rights being generated for all stakeholders via participation, as you would with, say, a political democracy, it's oligarchic in the sense that wealth, shareholding, generates political rights within the company. So it's sort of deeply unequal. But of course, the firm and the company is a much thicker, is a much more complex, much more social entity in which multiple stakeholders are key to its sort of, to the creation of value, and should have, therefore, economic and political rights to reflect the risk they bear, to reflect the input they put in, to reflect the value they create. So an alternative vision would see the company reimagined not as sort of something controlled by and for shareholders alone, but as a multi-stakeholder entity. So of course, shareholders would be at the heart of that. But alongside that, there would be voice and rights, economic and political, for workers, for stakeholders outside of the firm, sort of social institutions. And in doing so, we'd need to democratize the constitution of the company, how we allocate voice and rights within the company. So instead of assigning economic coordination rights, who gets to decide, who gets to control, based solely on private share ownership, we can reimagine the company as an institution of the commons, a shared resource, stewarded together, wealth created together, but democratically managed in that process. So what would that look like? And I think, what's striking in some ways, I think, what I'm going to go on to say in terms of an agenda is actually already been said. So I think there's a real striking recognition, and you can see this across the piece. If you look at, presentations by the IMF, the OECD, through to sort of, I guess, more progressive historically institutions, there's a real sort of recognition now that we need to reimagine the company, that it's not working, that the social contract at the heart of the corporation needs to be rewritten. So what could that look like? Well, it would be about corporate governance reimagined so that it recognizes and gives voice to the firm's stakeholders. So that's, most obviously, mimicking sort of the norm of European sort of stakeholder capitalism by allowing for workers to be elected onto the board to make sure their voice is represented in strategic decision-making. It would be about reshaping company purpose and in particular ending shareholder primacy. And key to that really is a sort of legal intervention to recode the Companies Act to sort of, deprioritize shareholders as the key sort of maximization of value as the key target. But I think more than that, it will require a cultural shift that, as already mentioned, many managers and CEOs already recognize that, the purpose of the company is not to maximize value for shareholders, it's to maximize sort of value in and of itself as a good. And then one natural consequence of that is, of course, generating the wealth that can be distributed to both workers and shareholders. It's also about extending the economic franchise by making workers members of the companies they work with. So if the 19th century was defined by the sort of political struggle for the extension of the franchise, eventually won in the 20th century, the 20th century was, of course, in some ways defined by the struggle to extend the social franchise of democracy, the extension of, sort of social rights, of welfare systems. In some ways, the 21st century vision for the company should be about extending economic democracy. So giving voting rights automatically as a right of membership as a sort of employee to all employees. They would be able to vote in company meetings. They'd be able to sort of have a say, just as the external shareholders do. It's also about building up collective ownership stakes of the economic interest, both inside, so workers are, have a real commitment to the firm and all the productivity and well-being benefits that generates, but also outside the firm, so that in capital markets, there's much more democratic co-determination of investment flows and active stewardship. So the ultimate beneficiary, for example, pensioners, pension funds, they'd be able to make sure that their investments are going into companies that have strong labor rights that sort of are working towards net zero. Talking of net zero, the pandemic is an extraordinary crisis, but of course the climate crisis dwarfs it and it's accelerating. And in the UK today, there's some very interesting news from the UK government on as a first step towards addressing that. But really, we have to go further. If we want to address the climate crisis, we can't just rely on public investment and sort of crowding in a private investment. We have to embed net zero principles into the sort of fabric of the company, because ultimately it's the company which is one of the key drivers of material throughput through our economy. It's one of the key drivers of rising emissions. So unless we redesign the company and its interaction with its natural world, we won't be able to address these things. And that in part, as mentioned already, means we have to think about auditing, we have to think about how we measure value, how we do accounting, and so really reshape that. So that's an ambitious agenda, and I think it was already one of the sort of a reasonable question in the chat line. That sounds great, but how do you do this? So I'll just end by saying this vision of a sort of democratic, more productive, more inclusive stakeholder model of the firm that guarantees economic and political rights much more broadly, much more democratically than the sort of current narrow-shelled, focused vision of the firm may seem quite a sort of big step. But I think it's actually a really pluralistic and exciting agenda because it can bind in a whole set of coalitions. It can bind in, as mentioned, those CEOs that actually really want to focus on creating productivity and investment in their firm rather than just sort of broadening shareholders. It can be about addressing the major environmental, economic, and social challenges facing us. And it can be about building an economy in which all of us have a stake and a say. So I think there's a real political coalition to be built there that can cut across traditional sort of ideological and party lines in the UK and beyond. And in doing so, we can build that sort of momentum towards renewing the social contract at the heart of which is a reimagined corporation.
Thank you so much, Matthew. Receiving some feedback, but thank you so much, Matthew. This fascinating work around the institution of the commons, and your call for a deep systemic shift, truly urgent. And last but not least, I would love to introduce Steve. Could you also share your background? You've done a ton of thinking about how and why corporations can make contributions to good. So we'd love to hear how the impacts of COVID are shifting this relationship, business and society, and why is it so urgent to take action today? Over to you.
Hi, can you hear me, Katie? I'm just checking before.
I can.
Wonderful, because I can't see my little microphone thing as up. So anyway, it's a real pleasure to be here, and I've really enjoyed the contributions of the other speakers. So thanks for the opportunity. My name's Steve Brammer. I'm currently Dean of the School of Management at the University of Bath, having held positions around the world at other universities. I guess I have two hats to wear in the conversation. The first hat I'll share is a kind of educational hat. So I've spent my career in business education, and I think there's a real question about the roles and responsibilities of business education. At the end of the day, we educate every year thousands of students who go off into the corporate sector and are the leaders of today's and tomorrow's businesses. And I think there's a really interesting question about the skills, the capabilities, the insights, the perspectives that we provide that community with in order that the future role of business and society can be navigated successfully. So I think there's an interesting question around that. My other hat, if you like, is as someone who's spent their life academically conducting research on and with large business organizations in questions of sustainability, of responsibility, and of stakeholder relationship building. My work's all been about how organizations engage with their stakeholders and what the consequences of that are for reputation, for financial performance, for other things. So most recently, within that work on firm stakeholder relations, my concern has been really how COVID has affected how organizations think about and enact those responsibilities. And I'll share a little bit about that thinking, and I'll be perhaps a little bleaker than I would normally be. Those who meet me in other contexts, I'm an inherent optimist, but I actually feel quite bleak around where we are in the world at the moment. And I'll share a little bit about that and some pessimism in relation to how I think we achieve the thing I think we're probably all united in wanting to achieve, which is a sort of a fundamental institutional shift here in the role that business is playing in society. COVID, it seems to me, is a really interesting window on the world. I think it has it's brought a lot of issues that were sort of latent in society to the fore, and I think it provides a window in how organizations think about their responsibility, what the limitations on organizations are in terms of living and realizing those responsibilities really are. COVID has provoked, I think, a profound shift in society in terms of social expectations of businesses, just as it has social expectations of government and indeed social expectations of each other in relation to citizenship and solidarity and what it means for us all either to be in this together or to not be in this together. I think that's a really interesting phenomenon. So COVID has had profound effects, it goes without saying, on global health. It's a public health crisis on the one hand, it's clearly an economic crisis on another hand, and it's also, I think, a crisis for our communities and our citizenships. I think COVID is a sort of moment of realization, if you like, within which I think we learn quite a lot about the stability, the fragility, the limitations of the way in which our economic and social order is configured at the moment. And it gives us, I think, a really clear opportunity to think about what's working and what's not working so well in a way that is potentially very consequential, but only potentially. I'll come back to that point about potentially momentarily. Certainly, COVID has caused, I think, a lot of reflection, a lot of calls in society for business to really live that social purpose. And I think, rather as Alan was saying, and rather as some of the fundamental research has shown, the picture on that, I think, is rather mixed. Some organisations have undoubtedly really stepped up. Equally, I think that there are a range of senses in which, and a range of organisations I don't think have really stepped up. And I'll just play a little bit of that out for colleagues. Of course, it has to be recognised. Let's not be naive around this. This is an extremely challenging time for the corporate sector. No one is saying any of this is particularly easy, and it's easy to sit on high and cast doubt and criticism down on our colleagues in the corporate sector. I don't for a minute want colleagues to think that's what I'm in the business of doing in general. I do think, though, that one of the things that needs to be said is that COVID is causing a genuine crisis of corporate purpose. I think this isn't just a public health crisis or an economic crisis. I think it is genuinely a crisis of corporate purpose. And I think that it's easy, I think, to think about some of the ways in which corporations, and I use that word to sort of encompass a broad range of different types of business as well as formal corporate forms, have responded to COVID, I think are really quite troubling. And I think, I guess my point that I'll return to in a minute is there are choices involved in this. This isn't inevitable. It is part of an outcome of a mindful decision-making process, and that's the thing I think I find most concerning in this. So, what has COVID done? Well, it's turned back certainly gender equity and possibly racial equity back decades. Think about the disproportionate effects of COVID on unemployment rates among women and men. Think about the disproportionate effects for non-white women and men in employment. Think about the impacts that we see in early research on wage disparities. The reality of COVID is it has affected some groups in society dramatically more than others. And again, that's not just some sort of random data phenomenon. Behind each one of those statistics, and the world's full of them these days, there is a decision. And I think part of what we need to do and face up to as people having a dialogue around where business and society are up to is to recognize there's a set of decisions there that has driven those kinds of outcomes. The impacts in global value chains are profound, and we've seen a number of cases in the UK where partly because of what health screening has told us about the way that some communities that were hidden perhaps from public view existed, what it's highlighted is modern slavery in Western economies. We're used to seeing poor conditions in supply chains internationally, and perhaps we turn a blind eye to that. When we see it in our own towns and cities, local to home, I think we've got to ask questions about how corporates are behaving, but also how we in society are allowing those organisations to behave in a way that I think is profoundly disturbing. I think there are enormous impacts on the world of work, and I'll return to some of these in a minute. I think it's interesting and troubling to me, many of the conversations I've seen around how organisations are protecting or otherwise their employees in relation to expectations of what they will and won't do in the context of their work at this time. I think that's a particularly troubling interface also. So I think there's a lot of things going on, not least large enterprise receiving large amounts of money from government and then making thousands of workers redundant. So bailouts that then are responded to in a sense as the profit maximizing entity would or should, I think it is a signal of a disconnect, of a deafness within the corporate sector to what social expectations are of them at this time. And I think my own view is that will have long run consequences for those organizations actually. So the meta point here is that COVID has had a variety of effects in economy and society. Some of those effects are ultimately, though, a matter of decision-making within the boundaries of corporate and other business forms, right? That business has a responsibility here, and we can see in a variety of domains through COVID how organizations are living or principally not living or finding it challenging to live those wider social purposes, and I think that's really disturbing. I think there's a really interesting sort of dimension of where society's up to here. At one level, I think society has become more fragmented and testy and contested in various ways. At the same time, through COVID, what we've seen is a lot of social solidarity, for example, around recognition for key workers and medical workers. I find that juxtaposition of testy fragmentation with signals of social solidarity actually quite an interesting juxtaposition. So, for me, the question is, I think, in the very broadest of terms, I think COVID has shown the fragility of the corporate form. I think it's shown it to be short-termist. It's shown broadly that the corporate sector wasn't well prepared for shocks like COVID, and one might say, well, why should they be? But resilient institutions really ought to be better prepared for unforeseen shocks than they've turned out to be. I also think partly because of that lack of preparedness, I think that the COVID has called into question, in my mind, the reality of the commitment to broader social purpose that one sees quite widely among businesses. And I think there's a real question about how business gets back on track and builds that trust, because I think there's been a substantial further erosion. For me, the questions from here are, where do we go from here? And I think there are a range of different possibilities. There's a call in society to get back to normal, and I think there are countervailing questions around whether getting back to normal is possible. Can we even go back to something like where we were? There are, of course, and this is part of what I think a number of people have said today on the panel, there's also real questions about the desirability of going back to where we were. We were already a long way from where we need to be in terms of resolving things like the climate challenge and the equity challenge in society. That leads, I think, to calls for, could we build back better, or do we end up building back worse? Does the crisis cause a retrenchment, in a sense, in the corporate sector to much more core traditional kinds of purpose, or does it lead to a reimagination and a reinvigoration or refreshment of commitment to that broader social purpose? And I think that's the extremely live question as we sit here today. For me, part of what I'm beginning to see in my own work is echo really what we saw coming out of the global financial crisis. Now, the global financial crisis was a fundamentally different kind of event, I'll acknowledge, but it was similar in the sense that it was an enormous shock to the corporate sector, at least substantial parts of the corporate sector, and called into question how organizations were responding to society. My concern, and I'm seeing this in particularly labor relations kind of questions in relation to how organizations are thinking about their expectations of employees as we begin, he says, hoping and thinking about vaccines and test and trace systems that hopefully will bring a greater normality to daily life around the world in the coming months. It seems to me that if anything, that reassertion of employer rights over employees is a really significant trend. And part of what one saw after the global financial crisis was during the crisis, there was a lot of talk about how we needed new institutions and new powers and new governance and new ways of holding business into account. And what in fact emerged from that was an incredibly watered down response. At a fundamental level, global society, or at least the regulatory and governmental authorities of major economies, determined that it was in their interests not to over-regulate the sector. My fear here is that a similar kind of short-term need-based economic logic causes governments and societies around the world who need these organizations to provide employment and all the rest of it, actually to walk away from a conversation about a more fundamental reconfiguration of the role of business in society, to take us back actually to something that is, if anything, somewhat worse than what we had pre-crisis. So I am concerned, and I'd be very interested to hear from colleagues who are listening and also colleagues on the panel, for the willingness, the collective will to mobilize around a new imagination for what corporations could be in society. As I sit here today, I feel somewhat pessimistic around that, if I'm completely candid. I'll stop there and note that I'm past my time and it's time for Q&A.
Thank you so much, Steve. That really helped us root back into the present, the current moment. I don't think you were too pessimistic, but very real about challenges. And I think the point that you drove home about how these choices is actually quite opportunity for change, but we need to touch on this willingness to mobilize, this willingness to change. So thank you to all of these speakers. Yes, this is time for Q&A, so please do post your questions. And I'd like to start, there's this idea of corporate purpose. So each of you touched on this in a different way. Steve, you just said we are in a crisis of corporate purpose. Alan, you said, profits being the sole function of business, that we can't think about it this way anymore. We're value creators. So I'd like to return to this idea of purpose and start, Alan, I'll start with you. But what is the purpose of a corporation in the 21st century? And also, how do we rebuild the trust that we've lost between corporations and society?
The purpose. A group of us, including many business people, asked that question back in 2006 or 7 under an umbrella called Corporation 2020. And there were up to read 2020 as in vision and as a years ahead. So it intentionally was dual purposed. And the group came up with one definition of purpose for corporations. It said the purpose of the corporation is to harness private interest to serve the public good. So, looking back on that, I won't say it stood the test of time, but I think it is actually, I might repeat that with some alterations, but not too many, even today, a decade and a half later. Harness private interest to serve the public good, or public interest, I think is the language. So it allows for profit, it allows for shareholding, and it allows for many things that companies already do, but it allows for them only within a container, and that container is the public interest.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, those few words, 6, 7 words, may say it all. You can have hours of discussions around what the public good is, what the public interest is, what the private interest is. But I think conceptually, it's saying that we recognize the need for private initiative in society. It's enriching, intellectually enriching. It builds innovation. It does create value, but we can never forget the container in which all this needs to happen, and that's the public interest. Mm-hmm. And then Corporation 2020 went on with several other principles and a whole raft of discussions and seminars and so forth. You can look at the site for those who are interested, corporation2020.org. So that's my concise response to it. Was there a second half to your question, Katie?
The second half is about rebuilding trust with society. So how do we rebuild the trust between business and society?
Yeah. Well, I think we heard a lot of that from thoughts on that from Alexandra as well as other speakers. Trust has to be earned. It doesn't come automatically. And the trust that has faltered in the last, I think particularly the last 2 decades, well, let's say maybe three plus decades, since the Reagan, Thatcher regimes. I think a lot of that trust has suffered because people feel business, they are victims, they are subject to a cycle that reinforces power, money, power, money. So money buys you access and buys you influence. The U.S. is the worst case of this, but of course it's you can find it in China, you can find it in Argentina. It's the same essential principle. Money yields power, and power then enables through various devices, tax policy, tax codes, deregulation, all the instruments of government, provides then more, enables more wealth accumulation, which in turn enables further accumulation, exercise of power. So if you distill it to this basic circularity and think, how do we break that chain? How do we disengage the power, wealth, power circularity in society? That's, I think, lies at the heart. Whether you're in India or South Africa, anywhere, that is sort of the essence of it. And then we can get into a much longer conversation than this is allowed here about about lobbying, about disclosure, about tax policy, all the other things that enable this circularity to perpetuate itself.
Thank you so much, Alan. And Mathew, I think you touched on that a lot, about that circularity piece and that movement of wealth. I'd love now to bring in Alexandra to dig in a bit more to the Responsibility 100 Index and how we're rethinking this relationship of trust between business and society. And a question for you about the index: if you are an inherently damaging industry, such as to the environment, such as mining, how do we build trust? How does this show up on the index? And how do you align your purpose to this 21st century social contract that we're talking about? And so if, for example, you're an inherently damaging country, how do you show up on this index? Can you be a good corporate citizen?
I mean, look, it's a great question, and and one that we grapple with a lot. Can you be a good miner? Is there such a thing, right? I mean, so we look at. I mean, so to answer that question, you sort of have to go back to look at what we don't measure, right? I mean, we're looking at what you're doing as a company, and I think one of the starkest examples of that is that we have got British American Tobacco on the index. It's a FTSE 100, and one of the first articles that were written about the index in the Wall Street Journal was the question of questioning whether that company should even be in the index. Now, we can't fiddle with the FTSE. The FTSE is how it is, and we're measuring them on the basis that they're there, so we couldn't, right? So but it threw up a lot of questions about that might be one that is, you can deal with that because you can actually say, look, inherently your product is only doing harm, right? And maybe there is a decision around putting a lethality index alongside the responsibility index to see like what kind of negative impact do you have, and do you create a threshold in the index in order to account for there's just a certain level that companies who do harm cannot rise above in that index. And that's something that we're thinking about. Now, that said, we have many in the extractive industry that's on the index, of course. And the way that it's structured now, we do look at the change in performance. So you can be a BP that has a new strategy and is investing heavily to move out of the current operations, if you will, to renewable energy and things like that. And that we want to reward, right? The question that Mathew touches on is the question of, is it a divestment question? I mean, so much power lies in the decisions that asset managers have, right? When they're allocating and they're creating portfolios, and what goes in, what doesn't, and what is used to screen those selections and the decisions that are made, right? So what what do you do? Do you reward the extractive businesses that are actually trying to move out of that and try to move into renewables, right? I think you do. So at present, that's the approach that we are taking. And the way that we do that technically is that we weigh, first of all, we weigh climate heavily in the index. It's essential, it's existential, I guess. And we weigh climate and we weigh human rights heavily, and everything else cascades from there. Not that everything else isn't important, but we just think that this is that's a decision that we made in terms of the structure of the index. Now we look at change and positive change, and we in the light that we give that more weight. So if you've got companies that are transitioning out from doing harm to doing less harm and actually doing good, that is something that we take into account, and you see a big boost in that, in the sort of performance of companies that do that. So I don't know if that is an answer to that question. We do grapple with it. Can you be a good miner? We look at the extractive businesses not only in the context of the 100, but also in the context of each other, and look at what is working and how are these companies changing, and looking at success stories and hoping that feeds in to inspire other companies in that sector to do the same. So in that way, that's the role that the index plays. Now, in terms of the other question around creating the question around trust, because I think that's an incredibly important issue when it comes to just from the citizen's perspective, looking at companies and how they're performing, and being able to trust that and that's sort of very much at the heart of the way that we structure the index. Can we trust that you're doing what you're saying that you're going to be doing, right? Essentially, that's the heart of how we structured this. Let's hold you to account to look at what is being done on the basis of what is being said. And in order to try and close the delta or the gap between the talk and the walk, we hope that it also creates more trust, that there is trust in that it will push companies to do more of what they're saying they're doing, and that creates more trust in the companies themselves. So essentially, it's a tool for companies to really focus on the trust issue from that perspective.
Thank you so much, Alexandra. Steve, I'd love to see if you have any follow-up thoughts to this point. And I don't mean to pick on extractives companies. There's a lot of companies that we could look at for their impact on the environment, on society. But what do you think about this doing less harm piece and what we need, the types of decisions we need companies to take today? Is doing less harm, is that good enough?
Look, I think it'd be a really good start. I think, look, I think there's one of the things I've learned, myself in my own practice through this period in leadership is that authenticity is really important. All right, so I've gone from having 5 staff meetings a year to having 2 a week. And that's been an interesting phenomenon actually, because what it's forced is lots of situations in which I say, I have literally no idea what the answer to your question is, but I'm going to go away and I'm going to, think about what we can do about it. And I think part of the issue here is I think that it's really important that some way or other organizations find an authentic way to engage with their stakeholders in determining what they're able to do, what they're not able to do, why they're doing certain things and why they're not doing other things. And I think that is, I think that's just really important in this whole conversation, because actually, shared understanding, I think, is a necessary precursor to really progressive change. I don't sit in my office looking at all my ESG ratings because I love ESG ratings, Alexandra. I've got more of them on my computer than the average human being. And I look at those and I think about what organizations are doing. I don't think there's a conspiracy here. I don't think people on major corporate boards sit around sort of how can we kind of create more harm in the world. That's not what they're doing, but there is nonetheless a kind of cumulative set of pressures on them that somehow leads to outcomes that are adverse. And it's very easy in leadership in organizations to where there are trade-offs and there are competing imperatives and there is limited attention span and so on and so forth, to end up with a set of decisions and outcomes that isn't that which you might wish. So I think that certainly minimizing harm, and I was looking at a thing this morning around the transition to electric vehicles in the UK, and they've brought forward the date where they're going to ban the sale of petrol and diesel cars and so on. I think all those kinds of things are terrifically important, but I also think there's an enormous opportunity. I've always felt there's an enormous opportunity for business to be genuinely progressively involved in society. Business is involved in society whether it likes it or not, right? It is, businesses exist in places, they have communities, they have employees, they have all sorts of communities that look to them for leadership and comfort and resource and engagement and meaning and all sorts of other things. And I think you'd be a funny kind of organization if you didn't think that was a set of dialogues to transparently and authentically have. And having done some of this myself, you won't hear what you want to hear always, and you won't hear the kinds of reactions that you expect always, because paternalistic action isn't appropriate either. Imagining what publics want isn't the way through this problem. You have to actually ask and respond in an authentic kind of way. So harm avoidance, and actually, having come back from Australia 6 months ago, I know quite a lot about the way that their extractive companies actually are extremely pro-social in a whole range of ways, for example, on Indigenous matters. So one of the complexities involved in being a responsible organisation is that, you may be digging stuff up out of the ground and that might have, environmental impacts, but there are lots of other senses in which, the value you're creating for all sorts of stakeholders is really significant. So I think how one weighs that ultimate bucket of really importantly positive contributions with the things that are, it must be acknowledged, problematic, I think is genuinely a big challenge.
Mhm.
Well, let me jump in a minute, if I may. Quickly.
Absolutely.
In the public conversation among many of what has been mentioned here by Steve and others, there's a blurring between stakeholder engagement and stakeholder inclusion.
Mhm.
Companies I know well are actually very good. Many are good at stakeholder engagement, and they're very less good at inclusion. So it's one thing to have outreach to communities, advisory committees, surveys of customers, local philanthropy, all these things, not to denigrate them. They're important, but they are nowhere near transformational. And they never will be until all those parties, whether it's an employee or customer or community, are at the table. They're not out in the next, outside the factory walls, if you will, or the shopping mall walls. They're inside, not outside. That's inclusion. And when Mathew talks about alternative forms of ownership, we have models of exactly that in various forms in Europe. Of course, co-determination is an example, whether it's Germany or Netherlands or others, where there are employees on the board. We have models of ownership where philanthropies literally have controlling interests in companies, like Novo Nordisk, for example. We have employee ownership organizations, large ones like the John Lewis Partnership, Mondragon in Spain, and many others. So it's not that we don't have models of what inclusion means, and operationally, we do. The issue is scaling. And it's not stopping where we are now, but we can imagine inclusion in so many things, whether it's board participation or ownership participation, whatever it is. And I just want to draw that line very clearly so we don't leave this discussion and our audience doesn't, to confuse conclusion with engagement. They are very, very different.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Alan. I'd like to bring this back to the financial services industry because we are at a tax conference. I see that is one of our questions. And so I'd like to ask this to Alan, Alexandra, and to Mathew. So first of all, Alan, could you help us understand why should tax professionals, why should the financial service industry care? What's the business case for the financial services industry to contribute to a new social contract? And Mathew, I'd love for you to answer that question as well, and some opportunities for the financial services industry. And then Alexandra, how does the financial services industry show up in the Responsibility 100? So first, Alan, could you help us understand why does the financial services industry need to?
The financial services industry is a sprawling, in my opinion, oversized element of our economy. So when we talk about financialization, we mean the financial industry, the one we know, investment houses, asset owners, asset managers, but we also know the financial industry actually is embodied in many of our product and service corporations, where they operate through dividend manipulation and buybacks and the rest of it. They're basically operating like almost a hedge fund in some cases. So just to point that out, let's remember that financialization expressed as many manifestations, not just in the financial industry, of course, by definition, but in the non-financial industry, so-called real economy. Why should they care about what we're talking about? Well, I think they should care because in the long term, the health of financial assets are only as strong as the health of the economy overall. And the health of the economy depends directly on the health and resilience of the corporations which are part of it. So there's a train there, a connection between shared prosperity, if you will, from the financial sector and the corporate sector. Now, some, of course, of the financial industry, traders, hedge funds, others, short investors, long term is irrelevant. In fact, long term is not even discussed over coffee. It's just simply not there. It's trading. Trading is trading per se is a good thing. The trade is the good thing, not the long term effects of that trading. It's simply not on the agenda. So for most, dare I say, institutional investors, pension funds, public pension funds, a Norwegian fund, Japanese funds, all these massive funds, institutional investors, they should care because long-termism has to be their game if they're going to thrive and survive and serve their clients.
Thank you. And Mathew, can you build on that? How do we get the financial services industry to think long-term?
Yeah, it was a really interesting, important question. I think it's partly helpful to sort of disaggregate sort of the financial industry. So there's obviously very different elements that constitute the financial sector with often very different time horizons. So I'd almost potentially sort of start where there's probably a sort of natural symmetry of interest. So looking at sort of pension funds, which obviously is a very substantial block of sort of capital, and by its nature has very long time horizons. This is worker savings that are, have to be around in 10, 15, 20 years. And there's no good, having a pension that's giving you income in 2050 if you're on a planet which is, sort of fried and has got, storms ripping through your back garden every day. So I think working with the pensions sector, and I think there is movement. I think it's a sort of difficult challenge, but there is movement. Frankly, building on some of the stuff and really sort of scaling the work of, some of the things Alexandra's been mentioning, like looking at how we can think about, asset management as a tool that, currently I think too often uses its power which ultimately is derived from other people's money, but uses its power to vote on resolutions and engaging companies in ways that, aren't necessarily long-termist when we look at the environment, and certainly in the short-term impacts are often pretty negative on workers and communities. So it's about thinking about some stuff that Alexandra's doing about how can we sort of design into asset management principles of stewardship of long-termism. So I think there's things there. I think there's sort of, there's some older sort of, potential traditions that could be returned to. So, there's a big debate in the 70s around pension fund socialism, this idea of like the rising sort of pool of worker capital controlled by, trade unions and how that invested. That might be a potential ally. I don't think there's any silver bullet, but that might be a potential ally sort of saying, okay, well, collective pools of worker capital, is there a way of the sort of pension trustees being democratized, being more sort of worker representation on that so that they can sort of embed that. But then I think it's also about redesigning the corporation itself. So, if the financial system flows into corporations which have, rewired their corporation, scaled different sort of sets of values and principles into how they operate and their purpose, then the financial system will sort of gravitate towards supporting those type of companies. So I think the answer is that there's multiple forms of financial sort of sectors. There's not just one financial sector, and we need to sort of work and extend and encourage those elements that are good. We need to sort of reform those elements that are sort of currently failing, and we need to bring to bear, sort of potential allies that are currently underutilized. For example, sort of worker savings, democratizing the ultimate beneficiary's claim on how their sort of savings are invested.
Thank you, Mathew. And we are running short on time, but Alexandra, I'd love to just hear quickly, can you touch on how the financial services industry shows up in the Responsibility 100 Index? Oh, you're on mute.
Yeah, can you hear me? It's actually, I just wanted to draw in one of the participants' questions. Nikki Phillips has made a very good point in the chat as a sort of a roundabout way to respond to your question, is that because we look at the FTSE 100 and not beyond that yet, I would say, we have Lloyd's as one of the banks that do best in our index, as Nikki is pointing out. But in terms of research on who is the ethical choice, Triados Bank shows up. And this is one of the issues with in indices that include some and not others, right? Then the others that might actually be better and performing better along these lines that we've talked about today are not getting included. So, but as I said to Nikki on the chat, we intend to include this and expand the index over time, so it has many, many, many more companies and good banks like Triados do not fall through the cracks, but get included and get the light shone on them to because they're good examples of banks in and of themselves that are doing well. Now, I mean, the selection process for asset managers is a different question, but I think we as a selection tool for asset managers, we hope that, and we certainly understand that the index is very much becoming more and more embedded in asset managers, filtering tools, etc. But in terms of banks, I mean, there are certain things that banks can do better than others, right? There's a whole question about, local community literacy, there's a big question around equality, diversity, gender diversity within the banking sector. We're still grappling with it, something that we track very closely, of course. And then there are areas that the banks can't do so well on, but just within their sector, yes, in the index, Lloyd's does very, very well across the board. So.
Thank you so much. And we are just about out of time. So I would just like to thank our panelists so much, Alexandra, Alan, Steve, and Matthew. You have helped us to understand the urgency of overhauling the social contract today, why it's the right moment to have this conversation. There's so much here to dig deeper on, the incentives for business and the different opportunities for business. But we already touched on a few of them and opportunities to hold companies accountable, and especially the role of the financial services industry. So as Steve said, there's a lot of choices for companies to make, and it's time to rethink and reimagine our current systems. And as Alan said, that we have models out there and partnerships, and we need to scale them and work together to really rethink our 21st century social contract. So thank you so much. I hope you all have a wonderful day and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank
Pleasure
you.
to work with you, all of you.